The North Atlantic, May 24, 1941. Dawn bleeds slowly across a sea the color of lead. The wind claws at the gray waves, tearing the tops into white spray. And through that restless wilderness moves a single British giant, HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, the embodiment of empire itself. Her decks are slick with dew. Her great guns stand black and silent against the sky. On the bridge, men huddle in greatcoats, faces pale in the weak Arctic light. Somewhere out there beyond the veil of mist waits the most feared battleship in the world, Bismarck. The hunt has ended. The duel is about to begin. At 05:52 hours, the first flash breaks the horizon. German shells whistle through the fog, crossing 7 miles of cold air in a single scream. They fall short, geysers of water higher than houses. A second salvo follows. Hood answers, her 4 15-inch guns belching flame and thunder. The Atlantic becomes an echo chamber of violence. The sea trembles. Metal shrieks. Men shout orders drowned by the roar. Then, at 05:57, a single orange spark blooms amidships. A shell from Bismarck's 5th salvo plunges through Hood's thin deck armor and finds the magazines below. For one impossible heartbeat, time stops. Then the world erupts. A pillar of fire 1,000 feet high tears the ship apart. From 20 miles away, witnesses see the flame pierce the clouds. The shockwave hammers through the fleet radios, shaking cups from shelves aboard Prince of Wales. And amid that thunder, before the static consumes everything, one voice breaks through the chaos. The wireless operator of HMS Hood, calling out into eternity. Hood has blown up. "We are on fire!" And then, nothing. The Atlantic swallows the signal, and with it the might of an empire's heart. Of the 418 men aboard, only 3 will live to tell what happened. But the message, that last desperate transmission, will race across every deck in the Royal Navy, stunning the fleet, shattering the illusion of invincibility, and igniting one of the greatest pursuits in naval history. The story of Hood did not begin in fire. It began in pride. In 1916, the British Empire still ruled the seas, but the thunder of Jutland had shaken that faith. The battle had proven that even giants could bleed. Britain needed a new symbol. A warship that would erase doubt, that would stand so tall no enemy would dare challenge her. Thus was conceived the mighty battlecruiser HMS Hood. 860 feet of armor and elegance, the longest warship in the world. The Empire's floating cathedral. Her keel was laid at John Brown and Company, Clydebank. Riveters worked by torchlight, sparks falling like stars onto the scaffolds. When her hull finally slipped into the water in 1918, the Great War was ending. But her legend was only beginning. Children lined the riverbanks, cheering as the Leviathan took her first breath. Newspapers called her the Mighty Hood. She was more than a ship. She was a promise that Britannia still ruled the waves. Inside, she was a city at sea. 2,000 men could live within her steel skin. Engineers, cooks, signalmen, gunners. Her decks stretched longer than 8 football fields. Her engines could drive her 32 knots, faster than any battleship alive. Her guns, 4 twin 15-inch turrets, could throw a shell weighing nearly a ton across 16 miles. To stand beside them when they fired was to feel the heartbeat of empire itself. Yet even as she was christened, her fate was sealed in design. Hood was a compromise between speed and armor. To outrun what she couldn't outgun, her deck plating was thin, a flaw that would later become fatal. But in the 1920s and 30s, no one cared. She was invincible because she looked invincible. She became the ambassador of a global empire. From the Mediterranean to the Pacific, Hood's gray hull glided into harbors where the Union Jack flew high and proud. She hosted kings, admirals, children in paper hats. In 1924, she sailed on a world cruise, 63,000 miles, 24 countries, a steel envoy of British power. Crowds filled docks from Cape Town to Sydney. In Singapore, schoolboys climbed lampposts to glimpse her turrets. In Canada, veterans wept as her band played Rule Britannia under fireworks. For those who served aboard her, the pride bordered on reverence. To say "I serve in Hood" was to wear an invisible crown. Her sailors called her simply the ship. Other vessels had names. She had identity. "You didn't join the Navy," one gunner recalled. "You joined Hood." By the late 1930s, the world darkened again. Germany rearmed. Hitler's Navy built new monsters, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the whispered supership Bismarck. Hood, already 2 decades old, remained the fleet flagship, her brass polished daily, her crew drilled to perfection. She was majestic, but time was showing. The Admiralty planned to refit her with thicker deck armor, but war arrived before the work began. When the guns spoke again in 1939, Hood sailed out as she was, beautiful, fast, and vulnerable. War at sea was changing. Aircraft had become predators. Submarines lurked like sharks beneath the waves. Yet Hood still embodied the old faith, that steel and seamanship could defy any foe. In 1940, she guarded convoys through the western approaches, her silhouette enough to drive U-boats under. Her very presence inspired confidence. Wherever Hood went, safety followed. Among her crew were boys barely out of school. Signalman Ted Briggs joined at 16, eyes bright with awe. He remembered the first time he walked her quarterdeck, the guns towering above him, the white ensign snapping in the wind. I felt, he later said, as though I'd stepped onto the back of a sleeping dragon. Life aboard was routine carved from danger. Dawn inspections, gunnery drills, endless cleaning. The decks gleamed like mirrors. The brass shone even during air raid warnings. Officers demanded precision. Every rope coiled, every salute sharp. Yet camaraderie thrived. In the mess, laughter echoed over mugs of cocoa. Stories swapped between storms. They were brothers wrapped in steel. In the spring of 1941, orders came that changed everything. German surface raiders were strangling Britain's lifeline, merchant convoys from America. Intelligence reported that the new battleship Bismarck had left the Baltic, escorted by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Their mission: break into the Atlantic and cut the arteries of empire. The Admiralty's response was immediate and furious. Admiral Sir John Tovey unleashed the home fleet. Every available ship was to join the hunt. At the center of it all, Hood, flagship of Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland. She would lead Prince of Wales, one of Britain's newest battleships, into the Denmark Strait, the old lion and the young cub. As Hood steamed north from Scapa Flow, the mood aboard was electric. Men whispered of the German Leviathan they were about to face. "If we meet her," one said, "it'll be the fight to end all fights." On May 22nd, the fleet sighted ice floes drifting past under the midnight sun. The sea was calm, the air knife cold. At the chart table, Holland traced his route with steady hands. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Bismarck was running west. On the morning of May 23rd, a reconnaissance aircraft from Suffolk reported contact. Enemy in sight, bearing 240 degrees. The hunt was over. Hood and Prince of Wales turned to intercept. Engines thundered. Signal lamps flashed between ships. Enemy to be engaged at first light. Below decks, men checked ammunition hoists, cleaned gun breeches, wrote letters they might never send. One stoker scribbled a line to his mother. "Don't worry, Mum, we're ready." Above, the sea darkened as fog rolled in. The giants closed the distance, unseen, unheard. In the early hours of May 24th, lookouts on Hood's foretop glimpsed two shapes on the horizon, gray shadows against gray dawn. The order went out. Action stations. Men ran to their posts, boots clanging on steel. The ship came alive with controlled fury, turbines howling, turrets turning. In the wireless room, young Ted Briggs strapped on his headset. The air smelled of oil, salt, and fear. Through the static came the crackle of incoming signals, bearings, distances, firing solutions. Every voice carried the edge of destiny, the last calm words over the ship's intercom. Open fire. The gray dawn of May 24th, 1941, rose cold and thin over the Denmark Strait. The wind blew from the northwest, sharpening every breath with Arctic bite. The sea was steel beneath the hulls of two British warships moving north at 28 knots, HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. They were hunting a shadow. For 36 hours, radar ghosts and radio fragments had teased them through fog and sleet. Somewhere beyond the horizon steamed Bismarck and her consort, Prince Eugen, carving their way toward the open Atlantic. If they broke through, Britain's supply lifeline could be strangled in weeks. Admiral Tovey's orders were clear. Find them, fight them, stop them. Aboard Hood, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland stood on the open bridge, gloved hands gripping the rail. He was 54, gaunt, eyes sharp behind round spectacles. The wind tore at his coat as he stared into the gray void ahead. Every few seconds he lifted binoculars, scanning the mist. His officers watched in silence. There was nothing to say. The enemy was out there somewhere in that endless gray. Below, the ship trembled with life. 144,000 horsepower roaring through turbines, deck plates vibrating like the pulse of a giant heart. In the magazines, sweating crews moved shells by hand 1/2 ton each, rolling them onto hydraulic hoists that led to the 15-inch guns above. The air reeked of cordite and oil. In the gunnery control tower, range takers adjusted dials with frozen fingers. Everyone waited. Waiting was the hardest part. At 05:35 hours, the lookout on Prince of Wales shouted through his loudhailer, "Enemy in sight." 2 ships bearing green 30. The tension broke like a snapped wire. Holland turned. "Signal the fleet, engage the enemy." From both British ships, flags snapped up halyards. Steam vents hissed. The battle line tightened. Hood and Prince of Wales swung onto a converging course, cutting diagonally across the strait. The distance closed fast, 17 miles, then 16. The Germans, hulking and dark, began to emerge from the morning haze. Through binoculars, officers made out the blunt tower mast of Bismarck and the sleeker silhouette of Prince Eugen. The enemy had the weather gauge, the wind and sun behind them. It meant their gunners could see clearly while the British looked into the glare. But Hood's crew didn't care. For 20 years she had been the Navy's pride, undefeated, unchallenged. Now they would prove it again. Open fire! At 05:52, Hood's forward turrets roared. 4 15-inch shells, each weighing nearly a ton, screamed toward Bismarck across the sea. The shockwave rattled bulkheads. Deck planks quivered underfoot. Seconds later, geysers of water rose around the German ships, close but not close enough. The gunners reloaded, the breeches slamming shut with a thunderous clang. The men worked like a machine. Bismarck answered immediately. 8 15-inch guns fired in perfect unison. The salvo came like the voice of a god, a deep rolling thunder that shook the world. The shells passed overhead with a sound no man ever forgot. A moaning, tearing shriek as tons of steel cut through air faster than thought. They struck the sea around Hood, colossal pillars of white water climbing higher than her masts. Spray drenched the bridge. Holland wiped his glasses with a trembling hand. "Plot course 280, he ordered. "We must close the range." He wanted to bring the fight to within 10 miles where Hood's flat trajectory would hit Bismarck's weaker side armor. But it meant turning directly toward the German guns, running into the storm. At 05:55, Bismarck found her aim. Her third salvo straddled Hood, one shell piercing through the afterboat deck but failing to explode. Shrapnel tore across the open air, slicing through men like invisible scythes. The wounded fell silently, their screams lost to the roar of the guns. Still, the ship pressed on, engines howling. Below decks, in the forward magazine, Petty Officer Ted Briggs sat at his radio table, headphones clamped tight. The world was a blur of static and coded chatter. "Range decreasing. Enemy bearing steady," came the voice from gunnery control. Then the background noise of heavy shells, closer now. Briggs scribbled a note on his pad. 05:56 on under heavy fire. He had no idea that within 1 minute, the ship around him would cease to exist. The German gunnery officer aboard Bismarck, Adalbert Schneider, adjusted his rangefinder. The sea was calm, the target steady. His voice was flat. "Feuer!" The 5th salvo left the guns at 05:57. The shells arced high, black dots against the morning light. One plunged through Hood's deck near the mainmast, driving deep into her after magazines. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the sea lit up. A detonation ripped through the ship from stern to bow. A blast so immense that witnesses aboard Prince of Wales felt the heat on their faces 6 miles away. The midsection of Hood vanished in a bloom of orange and black. Her stern lifted out of the water, breaking apart like paper. The shockwave shattered windows in the British ship's control tower. On Hood, the blast tore through compartments faster than men could react. Bulkheads collapsed. The decks heaved. Fire raced through oil lines and ammunition stores. The ship, once the Empire's pride, became a volcano of steel. From the wireless room, Briggs was thrown against the bulkhead. He felt the air itself tear apart. The lights went out. Through the static, he caught a voice on the radio, his own operator shouting over the chaos. "Hood has blown up. We are on fire." Then the transmission cut to static. On the bridge, Holland was gone. The entire aft section of the ship had disintegrated. Only the forward hull remained intact, plunging into the sea bow first. Men leaped overboard into burning oil, the water boiling around them. In less than 3 minutes, HMS Hood, 47,000 tons of steel, the symbol of British might, was gone. Aboard Prince of Wales, stunned silence filled the bridge. The crew watched the column of smoke rise thousands of feet into the sky. One officer whispered, "She's gone. My God, she's gone." Captain Leach gave the order. "Keep firing." They did, tears streaming down soot-blackened faces. At 06 hour, the only sounds on the radio were static and the ocean. Fleet Command at Scapa Flow received fragments, broken Morse. One half-formed sentence, a single word repeated before the signal vanished into ether. Hood. Sunk. Across the Royal Navy, disbelief turned to fury. In mess halls and engine rooms from Gibraltar to Alexandria, men stopped what they were doing and stared at the loudspeakers. The words repeated. Hood has been sunk by Bismarck. The impossible had happened. The invincible was gone. Back in the Denmark Strait, Prince of Wales turned hard to port, smoke pouring from her own battle damage. She had scored 3 hits on Bismarck, 1 in her forward fuel tank, but she was outgunned and outnumbered. Captain Leach ordered a withdrawal under smoke. The fight had lasted barely 8 minutes. As Prince of Wales retreated, survivors of Hood clung to wreckage in the freezing sea. There were only 3. Ted Briggs, signalman Colin Briggs, no relation, and midshipman William Dundas. They drifted among the wreckage, watching pieces of their ship burn and sink around them. Oil coated the water like ink. The cries of dying men faded one by one into the wind. Briggs would later remember, "The sea was on fire. I thought I'd gone deaf. I kept hearing the ship, the sounds of her breaking, and then nothing." By 07 Sau, rescue destroyers arrived, finding only debris and oil. They pulled the 3 men aboard, half dead from cold. When asked what had happened, Briggs could only whisper, "A shell hit the magazines. She blew apart." The officers nodded grimly. There was nothing else to say. That morning, the North Atlantic fell eerily still. The smoke from Hood's death hung for miles, drifting over waves like a funeral shroud. Even Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, stood on his bridge in silence, cap removed. "He is done for," he said softly. "Poor devils." For a brief moment, enemies shared the same awe and fear of what they had witnessed. Word of Hood's loss reached London by midday. Churchill, informed by telephone at Admiralty House, stared out the window for a long moment before speaking. "This is a disaster," he said. Then turning to his staff, his voice hardened. "Sink the Bismarck." Across the Royal Navy, those words became an order, a prayer, and a promise. Ships from every corner of the Atlantic converged. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, even aircraft carriers. The pride of the fleet had fallen. Now vengeance would rise in her place. For the men who'd known Hood, the shock turned to obsession. In every wardroom, in every steel corridor, the same vow echoed, "We'll find her." The sea itself seemed to demand it. As night fell on May 24th, the Atlantic roared with engines. Somewhere ahead, Bismarck limped west, wounded but alive. The chase had begun, and every sailor knew what fueled it. Not strategy, not duty, but grief. The last transmission from HMS Hood still hissed in the headphones of fleet radio rooms, replayed again and again. A ghostly voice from the deep. "Hood has blown up. We are on fire." The North Atlantic never forgot the morning Hood died. For hours after the explosion, black smoke rolled across the sky, carried east by a biting wind. Waves glittered with fragments of steel and the floating ghosts of sailors' belongings. A torn cap, a prayer book, a photograph sealed in oil. Over the wireless, one phrase looped endlessly between ships. "Hood has blown up. We are on fire." By noon, the words had reached every mast and mess in the Royal Navy. Shock hardened into rage. From Scapa Flow to Gibraltar, captains read the signal aloud to their crews. Men stood in silence, fists clenched. The impossible had happened. The Empire's pride was gone. At Admiralty House, Churchill listened in disbelief. The line crackled, then fell quiet. He turned to his staff and spoke the words that became law across the sea. "Sink the Bismarck." The hunt begins. Vice Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet, reacted within minutes. Orders flashed through the ether, calling every available ship to converge on Bismarck. The Germans were heading southwest. If they reached the open Atlantic, Britain's convoys would be slaughtered. The fleet fanned out like hounds loosed from the leash. King George V, Victorious, Norfolk, Suffolk, Rodney, Repulse, Renown, each ship receiving the same burning directive: engage the enemy until he is sunk. Above them, Royal Air Force Coastal Command aircraft scoured the sea lanes, searching for a trace, an oil slick, a wake, a shape beneath cloud shadow. But the Atlantic was vast, merciless, and the Bismarck was wounded yet still proud, her engines driving 15 knots through rising seas. On her bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann stood beside Admiral Günther Lütjens. The crew worked with grim precision. Damage control teams fought flooding in the forward fuel tanks. Engineers rigged pumps and collision mats. The ship had taken 3 hits, but her armor held. Smoke trailed from her bows, a wound that bled oil across the gray surface. She was hurt, but alive. Lütjens knew the Royal Navy would never stop. "The English will come for us with everything they have," he said quietly. "We must reach France." The sea's endless eyes all that day, the Atlantic played its cruel game of hide and seek. At dusk, Bismarck slipped from the radar screens of the British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk. For a moment, she vanished into the storm. Holland was dead. Tovey's quarry was invisible. On every British bridge, anxiety tasted like salt. But at 22 hours, Suffolk regained contact. Through breaks in the fog, her radar painted a faint blip, the giant running west. Messages raced through the fleet. Tovey altered course, his ships pounding through heavy seas. "We have her again," he said. "Now we keep her." Over the next 48 hours, an entire navy bent its will to one purpose. Ships burned precious fuel in pursuit. Crews worked without sleep. In the plotting rooms of the Admiralty, chalk lines crept across wall charts, arrows converging like claws. Somewhere between Iceland and Greenland, the hunters and the hunted were drawing ever closer. Victorious strikes on the night of May 24th. The aircraft carrier Victorious launched her Swordfish torpedo bombers, biplanes of wood and canvas against a Titan of steel. 13 of them clawed into the dark sky, engines sputtering, wings icing in the Arctic wind. They flew low over black water, guided only by radar echoes and faith. At 23:15, they found her. Flares turned the sea silver. Bismarck's guns opened in fury, a volcano of tracer fire, shells shredding the air. The Swordfish pilots weaved through the inferno, engines screaming. Torpedoes dropped one after another, splashing into the foam. One struck home amidships. The explosion shook Bismarck, throwing men from their feet. Damage was minor, but the psychological blow was not. Lütjens realized the British could reach him anywhere. "We are surrounded by ghosts," a sailor muttered. The Swordfish vanished into the night, one lost to flak. The attack had failed to cripple, but succeeded in one thing: the Bismarck was still being watched. Into the void at dawn on May 25th, Bismarck made her move. Turning sharply southwest, she passed through the shadow of Suffolk's radar and vanished. The fog thickened. The British lost her again. When the radar screen cleared, the sea was empty. Panic rippled through the home fleet. Tovey's charts showed a blank ocean. Somewhere out there, Bismarck was running free, and no one knew where. Reports came and went, each false. A sighting near Greenland, another off Ireland, a merchant's rumor. The North Atlantic was swallowing clues as fast as they were made. For 31 hours, Bismarck disappeared. Her engines drummed westward toward occupied France, hoping to reach the shelter of Luftwaffe air cover. In those 31 hours, the Royal Navy's fury hardened into desperation. Hood demanded vengeance, and vengeance needed a target. The signal intercept salvation came not from guns, but from signals. Deep beneath the countryside at Bletchley Park, British cryptanalysts monitored German naval traffic. At 08:46 on May 26th, an intercepted transmission gave Bismarck's course. She was heading for Brest. The message reached Tovey within the hour. All forces converge. From the south, Force H under Admiral James Somerville raced north from Gibraltar. His carrier, Ark Royal, launched patrols into the storm, searching for the Phantom. Pilots strained their eyes through sheets of rain. Then at 10:30 hours, a Catalina flying boat from Coastal Command spotted a gray shape far below. Enemy in sight! The chase was back on. The storm of iron by evening, Ark Royal's Swordfish were in the air. 15 biplanes against the monster. The weather was apocalyptic, rain slashing sideways, waves towering like cliffs. In that chaos, the frail aircraft flew at mast height, visibility almost zero. On Bismarck, Gunners spotted them and opened fire, walls of tracer carving the sky. At 21:05 hours, one torpedo found its mark. It struck near the rudder. The impact jammed the steering gear hard to port. The ship lurched, unable to turn. The crew tried everything, reverse engines, auxiliary steering, nothing worked. Bismarck could now only circle helplessly into the wind. Captain Lindemann stared at the compass repeater. "She will not answer her helm," he said. Around him, the bridge crew realized the truth. The pride of Germany was crippled. Radio messages flew to Berlin. Ship unmaneuverable, fighting until the last shell. The Royal Navy closed in. Night of the Wolves as darkness fell. Destroyers moved in like sharks. Cossack, Sikh, Maori, and Zulu attacked in waves, launching torpedoes through rain and lightning. Bismarck's guns replied blindly, each flash illuminating the tortured sea. One shell struck Cossack, ripping through her upper deck. But she survived to fire again. Throughout the night, the British hounded the German Titan, burning fuel they barely had, keeping her awake, harassed, disoriented. On Bismarck, men worked waist-deep in flooding compartments, patching holes with planks, carrying the wounded through smoke-filled corridors. They sang quietly to steady their hands, old sailors' hymns swallowed by thunder. Lucian sent one last message to Berlin. "We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." It was his epitaph. The final dawn at 08:47 hours on May 27th. The British battleships King George V and Rodney opened fire. The sea erupted. Bismarck answered with what guns she could still bring to bear, her salvos wide, her gunners blinded by smoke and flame. Shells weighing 2,000 pounds struck her again and again, tearing open armor, toppling turrets, shredding the superstructure. The bridge disappeared in a volcano of steel. For 45 minutes the duel continued, one ship standing alone against two. Even crippled, Bismarck fought like a cornered animal. Her last shells arced skyward, hopeless but proud. At 09:31 her guns fell silent. Fire engulfed her decks. Explosions tore through her hull. The order was given. Abandon ship. Men leaped into flaming water, faces black with soot, hands bleeding. At 10, British destroyers moved in. Dorsetshire launched torpedoes to finish her. 3 strikes sealed her fate. Slowly, majestically, Bismarck rolled to port. Her bow rose, her stern sank, and then she was gone. The Atlantic closed over her, indifferent and eternal. Silence after storm. When the guns stopped, only the wind remained. The sea was strewn with debris and survivors, hundreds of German sailors clinging to wreckage. The British destroyers hauled aboard as many as they could before a U-boat warning forced them away. 110 men survived out of more than 200. One British officer looked down at the faces in the water and murmured, "It's over." But in every mind, the image of Hood still burned. Justice, vengeance, grief, none could tell them apart. The message returns. That evening, as reports of Bismarck's destruction reached London, a signal was sent to all Royal Navy units. Bismarck sunk. Hood avenged. In wireless rooms across the fleet, operators listened in silence. Some smiled faintly, others wept. On the bridge of King George V, Admiral Tovey removed his cap and said quietly, "The finest ship of the line is gone. May this bring her peace." In the static between transmissions, men swore they could still hear it. That last message from the Northern Sea, faint as memory, clear as conscience. Hood has blown up. "We are on fire," the voice of loss now answered by thunder. The Atlantic wind carried more than salt that day. It carried a whisper. The voice of a dying ship, torn from the airwaves at the moment of her destruction, drifting through static into eternity. Hood has blown up. "We are on fire." Those words, just 7 syllables, would circle the world before nightfall. In every wireless cabin across the Royal Navy, men froze as the transmission cut through the chatter of coordinates and call signs. The voice was sharp, breathless, then swallowed by silence. Operators looked at one another in disbelief. They checked the dials, tapped the receivers, listened again. Nothing but the hiss of the ether. Then came the relay from Prince of Wales. Hood has exploded and sunk. At Scapa Flow, the duty officer repeated it aloud. The men in the operations room stopped moving. Coffee spilled on a map. One sailor whispered, "That's impossible." But the look on the captain's face said otherwise. The impossible had just happened. By noon, the message had reached London. In the basement war rooms beneath Whitehall, officers crowded around the communications desk as the telegram arrived from the home fleet. The clerk read it twice before handing it to the duty commander. Admiralty to First Sea Lord, HMS Hood has been sunk by enemy action. 3 survivors picked up. The silence that followed was the kind only found at funerals. In the corner, Churchill stood with his cigar unlit, eyes fixed on the paper. For years, Hood had been Britain's floating heart, her power, her pride, her myth. Now she was gone in 3 minutes. He exhaled slowly and said, "This changes everything." He turned to Admiral Pound. "Sink the Bismarck." Outside, Londoners went about their day unaware. The air raid sirens were quiet, the city gray with drizzle. But inside the Admiralty, a storm had begun. In the fleet's wireless rooms, the last transmission played again and again, copied by trembling hands into logbooks. "Hood has blown up. We are on fire." The message's raw simplicity made it unbearable. There was no poetry, no farewell, and only fact, stripped bare by shock. And yet, within that brevity lay everything: courage, disbelief, defiance. For the young signalman who heard it, it was like hearing the heartbeat of the Royal Navy stop mid-pulse. One recalled later, it was as if the sea itself had spoken and then fallen silent. Messages poured in from ships across the ocean. Confirm report. Repeat last. Any survivors? Each answer came back the same, none known. The wireless crackled with ghosts. On the deck of the battleship King George V, men gathered around the loudspeaker as the admiral's staff relayed the news. "Hood is lost." The words felt unreal. Some refused to believe it. "No, she can't be," one gunnery sergeant muttered. "Not Hood." But confirmation followed from Prince of Wales, from destroyers, from rescue craft. The pride of the fleet was gone. Officers lowered their caps. The sea, once alive with radio chatter, fell quiet except for the hiss of wind over aerials. In the sick bay, one petty officer sat at his bunk, head in his hands, whispering a prayer for men he'd trained with, drunk with, laughed with, gone in a flash of fire. He could still see her, sleek, magnificent, invincible. Now she was just smoke on the horizon. The impact on morale was tidal. For 2 decades, Hood had been the Navy's symbol of might, a reminder that Britannia ruled the waves. Her destruction shattered that illusion overnight. At every port, men stood before notice boards reading the news in disbelief. In pubs from Plymouth to Portsmouth, conversations fell silent. Some cursed the Germans, others cursed fate. But among the sailors, something deeper stirred. Not despair, but resolve. The last transmission was not an ending. It was a challenge. The words became an oath whispered on mess decks and bridge wings. "We will not let it stand." Sink the Bismarck wasn't just Churchill's order. It was the Navy's new heartbeat. In the days that followed, the message traveled farther than any signal before it. Across the Atlantic, American naval officers intercepted the same coded report. In Washington, analysts read the decrypted telegrams and stared at the word sunk. Admiral Stark muttered, "Good God." The Hood? Even the Germans were stunned. In Berlin, radio operators aboard Bismarck confirmed the kill, sending triumphant reports to high command. The Reich's propaganda machine celebrated instantly, the invincible British flagship destroyed by the new power of German steel. But even there, behind closed doors, some officers felt unease. The ferocity of the explosion, the suddenness, and it felt like an omen. Victory purchased too soon. Admiral Lutyens himself refused to gloat. In his cabin, he sat alone, listening to the engines thrum beneath his feet. "Poor devils," he murmured, recalling the fiery end. He understood what it meant, that the British would never rest now. He was right. Back in Britain, newspapers printed the story before dawn the next day. Hood lost in North Atlantic battle. Few survivors. The black headlines stretched across the page like wounds. Families woke to read names they knew. Sons, brothers, fathers. Telegraph boys rode bicycles through quiet streets delivering messages that began, "The Admiralty regrets to inform you." In a small house in Hampshire, Ted Briggs's mother received no message at all, his survival unknown for days. She sat by the radio, listening to the names being read, her hands clasped tight. The broadcast paused, then repeated the final signal. "Hood has blown up. We are on fire." Her eyes filled with tears. It was the last voice she thought she'd ever hear from her son. For the men still at sea, vengeance became ritual. Every ship in the Atlantic hunt carried the same scrap of paper in its radio log, the copied Morse of Hood's last words. Some placed it behind photographs, others tucked it under gun controls. It reminded them why they were there. On board Ark Royal, pilots of the Swordfish Squadron heard it before takeoff. The calm voice reading the transmission over the intercom, followed by silence. Then the flight leader said, "Let's make it count." Hours later, their torpedoes struck Bismarck's rudder, sealing her fate. When they returned to the carrier, soaked and shaking, the crew greeted them not with cheers but with quiet salutes. The work was not revenge, it was duty fulfilled. When Bismarck finally went down on May 27th, the British signals officers recorded the moment in the same tone of restraint. Enemy battleship sunk. Hood avenged. They sent it in plain language, unadorned, across every frequency once used by Hood. The reply came from the Admiralty. Message received. The King and the people of Britain thank the fleet, but in every ship's wireless room it was the ghost of Hood that seemed to answer back. That faint echo of her last broadcast, still alive in the static. Men claimed they could hear it in the background as if the sea itself repeated it back to them. "We are on fire." Months later, after the chase was over, after victory replaced grief, the logbooks were collected and archived. The Navy wanted to preserve the details of the engagement, times, bearings, shells fired. But among the neat columns of figures, one line stood out. Received transmission, Hood has blown up. We are on fire. Signal ceased abruptly at 0558, no embellishment. Just the moment the Empire gasped. Those 7 words would later be carved into the memorial stone at Scapa Flow, where survivors gathered each May. As they stood before it, heads bowed, one veteran said softly, "That was the sound of the old Navy dying, and the new one being born." Years later, in the age of peace, historians replayed the recording, the faint Morse dots and dashes preserved on archival paper tape. Even through the noise of time, it still carried power. The rhythm of it, urgent, human, spoke louder than any monument. For those who knew the code, it was easy to translate but impossible to hear without emotion. The simple pattern told a whole story. Men at their stations, smoke filling the compartment, fingers on the key, sending until the flames took them. They didn't call for help. They didn't send coordinates. They sent the truth. That was the Royal Navy, not invincible but unbroken. Decades passed. The wreck of HMS Hood was finally found in 2001, lying 3 miles beneath the waves. When the remotely operated camera first swept over her shattered hull, the operators in the control room fell silent. There, half buried in silt, still stood her nameplate, Hood, letters rusted but legible. The gash where the explosion began yawned open, frozen in time. The cameras moved into the wreck's interior, through twisted beams and collapsed decks. A bell hung from a broken bulkhead, still attached by a single corroded strap. It was recovered years later and restored, its surface polished until it gleamed again. In 2015, that bell was rung once for each man lost. When the sound echoed across the harbor, veterans wept. The last transmission had finally found its echo in the living world. Today, in the Naval Museum at Portsmouth, the recovered bell of HMS Hood stands beneath a spotlight. Visitors pass in silence. Some read the plaques. Others simply listen to the faint audio recording playing beside it, a recreation of that final signal. 7 words in static crackling through time. Children ask, did they survive? Parents shake their heads. But the guide always smiles softly and says, they sent their message. That means they never truly vanished. And so the story lives on. In the hum of a radio, the whisper of the sea, the echo of a Morse key tapping through memory. The men of HMS Hood spoke once in fire and courage, and the world still listens. Hood is blown up. We are on fire. It was not a cry of defeat. It was the voice of a nation's will to endure, preserved forever in the static between waves. The war moved on. Ships were built, battles were fought, and the map of Europe burned and bled. But for those who had heard it, for the men who had felt that last signal tremble through their headphones, Hood never left the airwaves. Years later, long after the guns fell silent, veterans could still recall the sound of it. A soft burst of static, the rhythm of dots and dashes, then silence. Some said they could still hear it when they stood alone on deck at night. the faint, unending whisper of a voice swallowed by the sea. Hood is blown up. We are on fire. The world had changed, but that voice was timeless. It carried the gravity of every sailor's oath. The truth that war at sea was not about glory or grandeur, but about endurance. Steel against water. Courage against chaos. Faith against the vast and merciless deep. The Empire's shadow in 1945. As victory finally came, the Royal Navy returned home battered but unbroken. The ocean was littered with the rusting hulks of what had once been pride. Battleships, cruisers, carriers. Yet among them all, it was the memory of Hood that endured. She had become more than a ship. She was myth and mourning combined. At Portsmouth, young recruits still learned her story as if it were scripture. In naval colleges, instructors traced her silhouette on chalkboards, explaining her flaws, her thin deck armor, her tragic vulnerability, and yet they spoke her name with reverence. Hood was not a failure. She was a reminder. For every man who had gone to sea after her loss, her final signal was a warning carried in their minds. No ship is unsinkable. No sea is safe. Letters from the lost. In the months after the explosion, the Admiralty continued to receive mail addressed to HMS Hood. Letters from mothers, wives, children, cheerful, ordinary, unaware. They piled up in the postroom, hundreds of envelopes marked "Return to Sender." Some were never opened. Others were gently forwarded to families with condolences attached. One was from a little girl in Yorkshire who had written to her father, "Dear Daddy, Mummy says you are on the big ship. I saw your ship in the paper. Please come home soon. I miss you." The letter was returned in a new envelope bearing the Admiralty seal. Inside, an officer had written, "Your father was very brave. He will not be coming home. Remember him always." That letter, preserved in the family's attic, would later be displayed at the National Maritime Museum, a small piece of paper heavier than any shell. The survivors of the 1,418 men aboard Hood, only 3 survived. They became living fragments of a legend that refused to fade. Ted Briggs, Colin Briggs, and William Dundas, the last witnesses to the ship's death. Ted Briggs, barely 20 years old at the time, carried the memory for the rest of his life. In interviews decades later, his voice would tremble as he described the blast, the roar, the light, the moment the sea turned upside down. "I was pulled under," he said. "Everything was black. I thought it was the end, but the sea spat me out again." When he was rescued, he kept asking, "Where's the ship?" The sailors who pulled him aboard didn't answer. They didn't need to. The empty horizon told him everything. He spent the rest of his life speaking for those who could not. Every May 24th, he attended the memorial service, standing in uniform, shoulders squared against the wind. When the bells tolled for the dead, he always saluted, even when age had bent his back and his arm shook. "It wasn't just a ship," he once said quietly. "It was home." The depths. In 2001, technology reached where memory could not. A deep-sea expedition led by filmmaker David Mearns located Hood's wreck 9,000 feet beneath the surface. When the cameras descended into the darkness and the first shapes appeared, torn steel, collapsed gun turrets, the broken hull lying split in two, the control room fell silent. The sea had preserved her like a monument. The forward section rested upright, bow proud even in death. The stern was gone, obliterated by the explosion that had ended her in an instant. Scattered around the wreck were personal relics, mugs, boots, helmets, the remains of lives cut short but never erased. As the camera passed along the shattered deck, the team saw the great brass letters still faintly visible on her side, HOOD. There it was, not just wreckage, but a word carved into the world's memory. The bell. When divers later returned to the site, they found something remarkable. Hood's bell, half buried in silt, still attached to its bracket. Corroded, encrusted yet intact, the same bell that had once rung out over ports around the world, announcing her arrival like a cathedral at sea. It was raised from the depths and restored over several years. When it was finally unveiled in 2015, the surviving families gathered at Portsmouth for the ceremony. As the sunlight touched its surface, Admiral Philip Jones stepped forward and rang it once for each life lost. The notes hung in the air, deep and pure, carrying across the harbor where gulls wheeled in silence. Ted Briggs was gone by then, but his words were read aloud. When that bell rings, it's their voice again. The ship still speaks. The sound of that bell became the new last transmission, not through radio waves, but through time itself. It rang across ceremonies, classrooms, documentaries. It was struck in Westminster Abbey on Remembrance Day, each toll echoing through stone arches, mingling with the faint hum of history. Visitors who heard it said it felt alive, as though the deep answered back. The bell's tone vibrated in the chest like the heartbeat of the sea, and when it stopped, you could almost hear the whisper that began it all. We are on fire. Memory and legacy today in the Maritime Museum at Greenwich. HMS Hood story fills an entire gallery. Behind glass rests her recovered bell, her ensign, fragments of her deck plating. There are photographs of smiling young sailors who never came home, letters stained with tears, medals awarded posthumously. Visitors walk slowly between the displays. Some are veterans. Others are schoolchildren seeing the war for the first time through human eyes. The guides speak softly, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts, and on a small monitor in the corner, the recreated sound of the last message plays on loop. Faint Morse, then silence. Every few minutes, someone stops to listen. Even now, 80 years later, it still has the power to stop hearts mid-beat. What remains the ocean is both grave and guardian. It holds its secrets close but never erases them entirely. Sunlight still filters down to where Hood lies, touching her rusted hull in thin gold threads. The currents drift gently through her open decks, whispering over the silent guns. Marine life has made her a reef, an ecosystem built upon remembrance. Fish dart through the shattered turrets, coral blooms on the steel, and in the stillness, time itself seems to pause. It is not a place of horror, but of peace. Each May 24th, wreaths are dropped above her resting place. The Navy still sends a ship to stand over those coordinates. Engines idling, crew at attention. The captain reads aloud the names of the fallen one by one. When the list ends, he adds the same closing words every year. Signal received and understood. The voice of the sea war is made of noise, gunfire, engines, orders shouted into wind. But what endures are the silences afterward. The gaps between transmissions, the moments when static fills the air. The realization that no one is answering anymore. In those silences, the Royal Navy found its conscience. The story of Hood taught a generation that pride without vigilance is peril, and that courage means not believing in invincibility, but standing ready when it fails. Her death reshaped the fleet, changed design, altered doctrine. Battleships grew heavier, stronger. Aircraft carriers rose to dominance. The Navy learned, and because of that, thousands of lives in later wars were saved. Out of tragedy came wisdom. The eternal signal. Even now, modern sailors know the tale. On night watches, they tell it quietly to new recruits, of the ship that ruled the waves and the message she sent as she burned. In radar rooms and sonar cabins, some still keep a small card pinned to the wall. Hood has blown up. We are on fire. Not as despair, but as defiance, a promise to never be caught unready again. In every generation, the Navy changes, the ships change, the world changes. But the radio waves of history never fade completely. Somewhere in that invisible ocean of sound, perhaps the signal still drifts, echoing faintly between sky and sea, not haunting but guiding. The men who sent it are long gone, but their message endures. A pulse that beats with every wave that breaks against the shore of England. Every gull that wheels above the gray water, every whisper of wind through the rigging of a ship underway. Because in the end, HMS Hood never really sank. She became part of the sea itself.